Well, welcome to everyone. So great to have you all here. So great to be in person again for a public event, especially one on the topic of such significance for our state and community. And the event today is called The Human Right to Housing, State and Local Challenges, with Sacramento Mayor Darrell Steinberg and respondents Tristia Bauman of the National Homelessness Law Center and Andrea Urton of Home First of Santa Clara County. I'm David DeCoste of the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics here at Santa Clara, and today's event is co-sponsored by the Santa Clara University Unhoused Initiative. You'll be hearing more about that in just a moment. The Santa Clara University School of Law and the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics. Today we'll first hear from the mayor and then responses, but there will be time, we intend, for audience questions. So you see the index cards. The way we're going to do it is write your question on an index card and send it to the end of the aisle, and we'll pick those up and then pose as many as we can to the panel. Also, those on Zoom, we really want your questions as well, so please put them in the questions or in the chat. We'll be monitoring that and hope to get those as many of those questions posed as well. So to introduce our panel and also to speak about the Unhoused Initiative, I wanted to turn things over to Professor Boo Riley of our Religious Studies Department. Professor Riley is the recent recipient of the Francisco Jimenez Faculty Award for service to our community. I think it's no exaggeration to say that Professor Riley has truly given heart and soul to trying to address the unhoused in our Santa Clara area. So, Professor Riley.
Some of my students might say that presumes I have a heart. So in the fourth quarter of the undergraduate quarter. So I'm charged to explain why or how we are here this afternoon. This is the inaugural event. We hope there will be more, but we plan there will be more, of what a group of faculty have named the Santa Clara University Unhoused Initiative. I'd like to take a moment to introduce those faculty who are my fellow collaborators on this. David DeCoste, who you've already met, and then Jamie Chang from Public Health. And Jamie, let me just stand up and give a wave. You'll do a little exercise here. Thank you. That was a very good wave. Sarita Tamaya Moraga, Religious Studies Department. And I should say the Unity RLC with their enthusiastic crowd there. Michelle Oberman maybe is joining us via Zoom from halfway around the world in Greece. And she's in the law school. And I'd also like to give a shout out to Marlene Bennett, who is a double Bronco, a public interest lawyer who has taught with Michelle in the law school and is also been helping us with the collaborative get going. And that's Charlene right there. Thank you. The Unhoused Initiative is an effort to coordinate Santa Clara's resources and talent, programs, facilities, and most importantly, faculty, students, and staff to help Santa Clara as a university engage one of the most vexing and painful social problems of our region, homelessness. We are interdisciplinary by design. In the coming months and years, we hope, the initiative will become a vehicle by which Santa Clara can, largely through partnerships with a wide array of community organizations in the region, some of whom are represented here today, through partnerships with them to support a multi-layered, and by that we're talking policy, direct service, research, advocacy, teaching, new courses, new pedagogies, as a way for the university to engage with homelessness in Silicon Valley. Today's event is a great illustration of what we hope the Unhoused Initiative can do. We invited, and they accepted, thank you, 3 amazing individuals to campus to share their work with you. I'm going to do a brief intro and then we will get going. Mayor Darrell Steinberg has a long history of public service, having served as a Sacramento City Councilman before being elected to the State Assembly and the State Senate. Among the several causes he championed as a state legislator was major investment in healthcare and education. He was the first Sacramentan, those of you from our capital city, to serve as president of the state Senate in more than 125 years. He was elected 57th mayor of Sacramento in 2016 and was reelected with a huge majority in 2020. Tristia Bauman comes to us from the National Homeless Law Center. It's an organization based in DC that is an incredible resource for anyone working on homelessness. She is a senior attorney with NHLC, where she works to combat the criminalization of homelessness and to advocate for laws that protect the civil and human rights of homeless people. She does trainings across the country, contributes to various reports related to housing and homelessness, and is a legal resource for homeless advocates. Since 2015, Andrea Urton has been CEO of Home First, a local organization whose mission is to end homelessness. Home First is multifaceted. For instance, it operates the largest shelter in Santa Clara County, is the service provider for San Jose's new bridge housing communities. They do one-on-one outreach to individuals living in encampments and on the streets, among other things. Andrea has been an adjunct professor here at SCU, so welcome back. And every winter and spring quarter, she welcomes my class of 25 or so SCU students to the Picardo Center for an amazing tour and discussion. So we're really grateful for all three of you being here. And without further ado, we're going to turn this microphone over to Mayor Steinberg. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. You can all see me and I'm on camera here. Very good. What a great honor to be here. You know, I was saying earlier to David, I grew up on the peninsula here in the Bay Area, lived in Sacramento. I've traveled all over the state and I've never been to Santa Clara University. And so I would say it's about time. And I could not think of a more important topic than the topic we are going to discuss here today. And really honored to be joined by Tristia Bauman and Andrea Urton, and I'm looking forward to hearing from them as well. And I invite you all to critique what I'm about to say, because it's a little bit provocative, and some might say it's maybe it's not realistic, but I don't believe so. And I want to share with you my experience and why I believe, for those of you, how many of you are law students? A few, okay. For those of you who are law students, and even those who are not law students or lawyers, why I strongly believe that the law itself is the missing piece of trying to, if not solve, make dramatically and demonstrably better this crisis we call homelessness. And so let me begin with this. And thank you, Dean, for welcoming me as well. Let me begin with this. I want to tell you my day-to-day life. I've had this storied career, you know, left out one thing, which I'm very proud of, which is that I'm the author of California's Millionaires Tax, the Mental Health Services Act, Proposition 63. Taxes millionaires to fund public mental health through the counties. Little did I know I was going to run for mayor of a city as opposed to a county back when I authored the initiative back in 2004. It now generates $4 billion a year of additional funding for mental health services. And yet the system and the systems are still broken. So I want to tell you what my life is about these days as mayor of the city. The city is not a health and human services agency. We've gotten into the homeless world out of necessity, frankly, because the majority of the problem is in the urban core, and it's also the right thing to do. But we're not a health and human services agency. I say that to you because as we've worked over this by 6 years as mayor to get 17,000 people from unsheltered status to being housed, you'd think we'd hold a parade, but no, We can't hold a parade, nor should we, because our problem is growing dramatically worse, where people are becoming homeless. Why is that? I mean, many reasons, but I think if you want to summarize it, it's systemic poverty. It's high housing costs. It's people not keeping up. It's COVID. It's people living in very fragile states, housed, who are one life event, the unexpected broken down car, the unexpected medical expense, the wage cut, the rent increase, away from being fragile and unsheltered. That's really what's happening here. And yes, a lot of people with existing medical fragilities, either on the mental health and substance abuse side, or people with significant physical issues as well. So we're working hard and we're trying and making some progress, but I've come to the conclusion that a city and cities themselves cannot do it alone, because so many people do need that health and human services component, in addition to the other services which counties provide: mental health, substance abuse, qualification for CalFresh, and other public benefits that allow people to gain the stability to end their homelessness and to have a path for a better life. And so for the last number of months, and in my county, just give you a little bit more, won't go into the weeds here too much, but we're a blue city, 500,000 people in a purple county. 3 out of 5 supervisors represent other than the city of Sacramento. 75% of the homeless problem is within the city of Sacramento. Houston, we have a math problem here in terms of power and representation. But we have exposed the idea that we can't do it alone. We need the county. And now we are at the table negotiating what I hope will be a very specific and hopeful agreement that will show the public that's very frustrated by this, and the advocates, the activists, and the people who are unsheltered themselves, that we can do even better. And we're negotiating everything from what intensive encampment engagement teams would look like, how many, how to navigate people and make them more easily eligible and signed up for the various benefits that they're eligible for, how to create more full service partnerships, which is the buzz phrase for under the Mental Health Services Act, Proposition 63, for whatever it takes to help people who are chronically homeless and need everything, and need it without having to run from pillar to post to try to get benefits that they are not capable because of their condition to be able to do on their own. We're negotiating, and I think it'll turn out well. But I ask myself often, why isn't the county doing more of this in my city on its own? And I even ask of my own city, why has it been such a struggle for me as mayor to make building more shelter a key fiscal priority and a key policy priority? Because cities, you know, they pick up the trash and they provide police and fire services and they provide the basics. Why has it been so hard? And there are many reasons, but I leave you with this very complex answer. The reason why these systems, mostly within the county, but also within the cities, are not doing more, the reason why it takes a Herculean negotiation to create a partnership agreement as opposed to it just being part of the way that it is, the reason why we don't do more is this complicated legal doctrine known as because the law does not require any of the systems to do so. It's so simple and basic that we ignore it as a source of the problem. everything that we do to combat homelessness, with some exceptions, and there is some progress the other way, but with some exceptions, is a bottom-up effort by good leaders, by great nonprofits, by great providers to be able to help and serve as many people as we can. But the systems themselves are not required to meet any standards, any production requirements. There's no right to housing. There is no right to shelter. There is no right to mental health care. There is no right to substance abuse treatment. And I believe that needs to change. Now, let's go back 50 years. When I was a little guy, but I read history, and I know this history because I've been involved in these issues for a long time. In 1977, when I was a high school senior, the legislature passed what was known as the Lanterman Act, not the Lanterman-Petra Short Act. That's a different act. The Lanterman Act. The Lanterman Act was the act that said the state is going to shut the developmental centers for those with developmental disabilities, not mental illness, although there's some co-occurring, but for those with developmental disabilities. It used to be known, now politically incorrect, people with mental retardation, but people with developmental disabilities. The state made the decision to begin shutting those state hospitals and to create the environment where people with developmental disabilities could live with dignity and as much independence as they were able to have in the community. And what did the legislature do in 1977? They made services for the developmentally disabled a lifetime entitlement. That's what they did. And right on. And the view, if you really want to think about the psychology behind the effort, is that people who are born with developmental disabilities, it's not their fault. It's not their fault. Right and right on. 10 years earlier, the same Frank Lanterman, by the way, was the lead on the Lanterman-Petra Short Act. This is the famous, remember when Reagan shut the state mental hospitals? Everybody, if you know nothing about California history, people kind of know that. It wasn't just Reagan. I'm a Democrat, but it was bipartisan. It was bipartisan. It was a well-intended effort back in 1967 to begin shutting the state mental hospitals. And because One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest may have been a fictional movie, but it was true. Those conditions were true. To shut the state hospitals and begin moving people with severe mental illness into the community with the array of supports that would enable people to live safely and independently. What did the legislature do in 1967 when they passed that law? They intentionally and deliberately did not provide a right to care or an entitlement to services for the people who were deinstitutionalized from the state mental hospitals. The developmentally disabled, essentially a right to lifetime services. The mentally ill, no right to services. And so why? I think many theories abound, but I believe that it is this been historic, implied and expressed discrimination against people with mental illness. Because those with brain-based disorders, it's their fault. And we see that playing out in so many ways that the public now views this issue of chronic homelessness. The distinction between the developmentally disabled and the mentally ill has had a profound impact on homelessness in California. Because my county, they do a lot of good work. They only have three in a county of 1.5 million homeless mental health outreach teams who actually go into the encampments. Not one of them is located in the city. Now, our negotiated or negotiation attempts to remedy that. But why don't they have more teams on their own in the city? Because they don't have to. There's no law that requires them to. So I become mayor and I look at New York City's longtime court brought right to shelter law. And it goes, it just goes off in my head here. All of a sudden, it's the epiphany moment. The law says that New York has to shelter everybody. And so I write an op-ed in the Los Angeles Times in July of 2019, where I call for a right to shelter in California. And Governor Newsom had appointed me as the chair of his statewide task force, co-chair of a statewide task force on homelessness. And over the last 3+ years now, I have been engaged, leading, but engaged in a debate, both at my city and statewide, about whether or not there ought to be a right to something significant when it comes to homelessness in California. When I put out the right to shelter, and by the way, I also added, controversially, that people ought also have an obligation to accept it if it's offered. We could talk about that as well. Might be some area of disagreement there, I don't know. But I believe the public policy of the society should be that people live indoors. I think the obligation falls 95% and first on the government and the society, and that if it's offered, living outside is not a civil right, but that's secondary. The right to shelter was criticized by advocates who said shelter is not enough. And I say, you're right. I just think we have to start somewhere. But we morphed it. I morphed it over time into thinking through what would it mean to have a right to housing in California, of which shelter could be a temporary component as part of a continuum for people, on their way to being housed. I also am the founder, after I left the Senate, of an institute in my name that advocates for reforming and changing our mental health system in California. And we've added to the argument that not only should there be a right to housing in California, but there should be a legal right to mental health care for people as well. It ought not to be the choice of government at either the state or local level whether or not to serve people who are living in our communities, who desperately need help, who are not getting the help that they need. And so what would a right to housing or mental health care actually mean? Why would it make a difference? Some say to me, well, it's a law. Okay, you're gonna make a law? What, you're gonna have judges decide all these questions? And I say, let me explain. Litigation, of course, should be a last resort. But the law sends signals to the society and all those responsible, whether in government or the private sector, about what matters and what's important. It is so deeply embedded in our consciousness that we don't even think about the significance of the following. The law in California says that every child is entitled to a free public education. And thus the law requires us through our school boards and our state to build these buildings we call public schools. Now, we're not in a public school here, but public schools, that's what we do. As a matter of fact. And why do we do that? Because we have deemed public education to be sufficiently important that we require it as a matter of law. Well, no matter how many crocodile tears we shed about homelessness, we are making an intentional decision to not prioritize housing in the same way, because there is no right to housing and there is no legal obligation for government at any level to produce with the private sector, not just government alone, with the private sector and the nonprofit sector to produce enough housing of any kind. How about manufactured housing, tiny homes, anything with dignity that's better than living out in the elements and being subject to all kinds of deprivations out on the streets of California. There is no obligation to meet the need and to meet the demand. So I often say that here in reality is what goes on. If I were to take this piece of paper and I were to draw a line down the middle of it, okay, and had two categories. On the left side would be obligations to build housing. And on the right side would be obstacles to building more housing in California. On the right-hand side, I would need multiple pieces of paper. Excuse me, because it would go like this, okay, on the right-hand side. Not in my backyard, excessive local control, excessive regulation that makes it difficult to build the housing, cost, lack of housing innovation, i.e. why we don't have more manufactured housing as a matter of, and finance it in the right way is beyond me. Lack of coordination between various levels of government responsible for the problem, cities, counties, and the state of California to meet the demand. The list would go on and on. On the left-hand side, it would be a very short list. Aside from the housing element law, which requires cities in California and counties to plan for a sufficient number of units to meet the need, there is no production requirement. There is nothing that requires society through its governments, working with its nonprofits and its private sector to produce more housing. And if there was a right to housing, I argue that there would at least be a counterforce to all of the obstacles on the right-hand side of the page. It would be more difficult for the NIMBY, the neighborhood, to say you can't build here because there would be a right to build here. If the numbers are so daunting, which they are, then we would have to say with the right to housing that, I'm sorry, we're going to have to change our one-size-fits-all tax credit gap financing model that requires $500,000 or more per unit of public subsidy to build a single unit of affordable or permanent supportive housing and actually build manufactured housing to meet the demand. I'm not saying it would cure the problem of magic boom, but the law would push us to much greater places and with much greater results. History is full of this precedent. Why did we desegregate the public schools in America? Well, many reasons, including social justice, obviously, in the movement, but it was also the law. It was Brown versus Board of Education. It was subsequent court cases. Why did we desegregate American life in the South eventually in all of its realms? Well, of course, it was the greatness of Dr. King and the civil rights movement, but it ultimately was the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act and the Fair Housing Law in 1966. The law matters. And right now, it's not helping us. And so I think we need to continue to push to make housing not just a human right, but a legal right. The ethics, I love the fact that this is all under the construct of ethics. The application of ethics to the real world, as David said to me when I arrived here this morning. Is what we're doing now ethical? Is allowing housing of any form to be merely an economic commodity an ethical way for a civil society to operate? I think the answer to that is obvious, but it's not enough to just declare housing as a human right. I mean, I love the ring to it, It's not a human right unless it's a legal right. We have a chance to change the law this year. This debate continues and it gets taken up in various forms. Now the counties under the law passed this year have an obligation after a court order to actually serve people with the most severe mental illnesses, but it's individualized court orders. And they get fined $1,000 a day once it's implemented if they're not following the court order. Well, okay, that's a start. But that's not a right to housing and a right to mental health care that sends that clear signal to everybody that you've got to improve these systems. Cities and counties, you've got to make these partnership agreements without all this hassle and all this struggle. You must serve the people who are the least among us and who are suffering. And you don't have to even have compassion for people. And I do, and I know you all do. But what homelessness is doing and the way it is roiling our state, if we don't do something like this, I'm worried that the counter reaction, you're already seeing it and feeling it, is going to be oppressive and it's not going to be effective. So there's something to fight for here together. And I appreciate your time and look forward to the feedback and your questions. Thank you very much.
Tristia, could I ask you to go first? This is Tristia Bauman of the National Homelessness Law Center.
All right, I'm going to try this one. I do tend to speak a little softly. How about now? Can you hear me?
This is a good mic too.
Great, thank you. Hi, my name is Tristia Bauman. I'm a senior attorney at the National Homelessness Law Center. The Law Center is based in Washington, D.C. I live here in Gilroy, California. Law Center has been around for over 30 years, and we are the national legal organization whose sole mission is to prevent and end homelessness using the power of the law. So one thing I want to agree with Mayor Steinberg about is that the law is very powerful and can be part of a solution. I also want to recognize that the law can be weaponized and has been weaponized against groups of people historically and today. The law can solve problems. It can also justify ownership of human beings. The law can provide opportunity. It can also result in the segregation of people into neighborhoods where there is no realistic opportunity. And I say that because I'd like to propose a framework. And another thing that I agree with Mayor Steinberg about is that the human rights approach is the correct approach. We have been fighting to end homelessness since our inception. We work on fighting criminalization of homelessness and punitive approaches to homelessness that fail, will always fail, are expensive, cause harm, and do absolutely no good for anyone. And the human rights approach is the correct approach. And the good news is, and I know that not a lot of people raise their hands in terms of who's in law school, but I can give a really quick primer on human rights law. Human rights law is developed at the international level, and there are 7 recognized elements of the human right to housing. And that includes things that we recognize as problematic here in the United States. We know, for example, that housing is just unaffordable. You heard Mayor Steinberg talk about that. That is correct. If you're renting, you know that your rent is going up and you know that your wages are staying stagnant. That is true across the country. We have a 7 million unit gap in extremely low income housing that is affordable to the people who need it most. And in that context, there will be people who are displaced from their housing, even if you clear an encampment using coercion or temporary settings. That same location will be filled with new people who are being displaced from their housing because we treat housing like a commodity, not a human right. In addition to affordability, there are other elements of the human right to housing. Those include things like cultural competency, location. Are these areas where people can work, where they can get high quality education? All of these elements are rooted in human dignity. And that's one of the main things that I want to leave you all with today, is that when you use a human rights approach, we need to consider the proposals through the framework and the lens of human dignity. And that's why I want to talk about 2 things that help us see when we've used that lens are not a human rights-based approach. So first, when we talk about things that are alternatives to housing, I hope that everyone here has housing and knows what housing provides. It's usually private, a place where you feel secure, a place where here in California, you're going to have some protection against forced eviction. You can control who walks into your room, who goes through your toothbrushes to see, how many people might be staying at your home. You're going to have some of those basic rights that you might take for granted, not even think that they could ever be violated. In temporary settings, that type of basic human dignity is not offered. You may not be alone. Most shelters in this country are offered in a congregate setting. That means you on a cot next to another stranger and 99 more strangers in one room. Now, it's important to recognize that's not a desirable setting for most people in any circumstance, but the people that are experiencing homelessness in this country are not, frankly, they don't look a lot like you. A lot of them don't have your background. The majority of people experiencing homelessness in this country have come from impoverished neighborhoods with limited opportunity or have been involved in systems that actively produce homelessness. People leaving the carceral system experience homelessness at 10 times the rate of the general population. Who does our carceral system affect most? We know that they're low-income communities. We know that they're Black and brown communities. 40% of the population of people who are experiencing homelessness are people with disabilities. I agree that people should have access to mental health treatment. We don't have that now, and people are vulnerable and they're displaced. And so when you put them into a setting that is not appropriate for people with trauma, with anxiety, with mobility issues, who are vulnerable physically, we're not talking about using a dignity-based approach to the housing crisis. And that same type of framework can be applied to tents in a sanctioned encampment, to a tiny home that might be a shack with literally nothing but some protection from the elements. And this is not to say that shelters don't serve a crisis intervention role or that sanctioned encampments don't. All of these things can be part of a continuum of care to meet crisis needs, but they are not housing. And that is clear when you apply a human rights framework. They should also never be coerced. Coercion is not consistent with human dignity. The human rights approach requires that people who will be clients or participants in a program have some say about the design and implementation of the program. It's important that when we think about what our governments are proposing to deal with an active crisis, we can all agree that human beings should not be living outside. That we think about the best and smartest approaches. Are we meeting the needs of people who are living outside now, or are we imposing what we think that they need? If I'm starving, someone offers me a blanket, I refuse the blanket. I'm not service resistant to eating. I am familiar with what a blanket does. A blanket can warm me, but I'm starving, I need food. I use that very simple analogy to explain that we have a service system that uses a one-size-fits-all approach and assumes that all people can use systems that are not best meant for all people. We do need a diversity of places where people can go. And people need to have some say about where they can go, because that's where their needs can be met. And that's how we can build trust. As I said before, the people who are living outside, most of them have familiarity with our systems. A lot of them are youth exiting foster care, people who have been involved in governmental systems and have a good sense of what they can provide and what they cannot, what say they have and what say they do not have. If we want to encourage people to use systems, we need to have good resources available that meet their needs, that treat them with dignity. It's commonsensical. That's what we know. And it's also what is inherent in the human rights approach to homelessness. So I leave you all with this thought. Human beings should not be living outside. It's not an appropriate setting for human beings. We at the Law Center do not fight for a right to live outside, but we do fight for human rights, for all people to be treated with dignity and to have their basic human needs met in a way that makes sense. And we can look to international law principles for help with that. And we should craft our domestic policy responses to this growing crisis rooted in those principles, and that's how we'll have success. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Baumann. And now Andrea Urton of Home First of Santa Clara County.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here today. Such an honor to be back on campus. I'm thrilled to be here with my Santa Clara University peeps. And I'd like to say thank you for both of the previous speakers. I don't even know how to follow that. Brilliant. I think there's so many things that we agree on and some touch points that we disagree on, but can be navigated. I think with the right conversation, respectfully navigated and dealt with and figured out. So Home First Services is the largest provider of homelessness services in Santa Clara County and Sonoma County. We've been doing this for 40 years. We offer a continuum of care from everything from diversion work, so keeping people housed, to outreach. We operate 4 very large intensive outreach programs, also including a new innovative program called SOAR, where we provide mental health and addiction services to camps on a regular basis. We also are the innovators of bridge housing and emergency interim housing, which is known as some of the tiny home housing that people talk about, with the city of San Jose. And I'd like to say 2 very special people who are here today, Karen Gillette and Phil Mastercola. Please raise your hands, guys. We started working on this 6-7 years ago. Governor Newsom came to recognize us twice during the pandemic for our work in this field. We also operate plethora of programs, housing specialists, case management, a whole department focused on veterans and their families, as well as permanent supportive housing. And we own and operate 4 affordable housing sites for formerly homeless families and individuals. So that's Home First. You can check us out at www.homefirstscc.org. or reach out to me with any questions afterwards. So I would like to say, although housing ordinance, making housing a human right is a beautiful idea, and I think a needed step in our society, we must be careful to address the systems that would make that possibility and ensure that it's operationalized process that can be governed, monitored, and enforced. And so what I mean by that is something that both of our speakers touched on. You know, housing as a human right is absolutely the way to go. But our systems are broken right now. And if we pass such an ordinance, which I am not opposed to, our systems are not set up to manage the need so that we can hold ourselves accountable to that ordinance in any way possible. Let's look at our mental health and substance abuse systems. 2 critical systems when dealing with people who have been chronically homeless. Because if you didn't come into homelessness with an issue, trust me, after 6 months, you have some mental health challenges, most likely PTSD, depression, anxiety. So shelters are not a comfortable place for somebody like that. We have 250 people at the Picardo Reception Center every single night. It's loud. You're next to somebody who might be having a psychotic episode. You might be next to somebody else who's a meth user. Your things will get stolen. You don't feel safe. I was homeless as a teenager. There is no possible way with my PTSD, I could have stayed in a congregate setting. So I chose to live elsewhere. Not only my car, but couch surfing. That's neither here nor there, but it's an example of someone who was able to do what she needed to do to graduate high school and move forward, where some people don't have the same ability. They might not have the same levels of resiliency or support in the community to be able to navigate something like that. So we have to be mindful of that. And when we look at our mental health systems, they're outpatient. So you're telling me that if you're struggling with PTSD or anxiety, and you're living in a camp, so crisis moment to crisis moment, you're going to be able to navigate yourself to an appointment once a week for 1 hour and navigate yourself back to a camp. And that's actually going to help you? It's not. Because what you need in the moment is crisis intervention. You don't need long-term mental health therapy. You need somebody to pick you up and put you in a house so you can get well. Same thing with our substance abuse systems. Right now, 95% of our substance abuse treatment is all outpatient. So if you're trying to recover from meth and you're living in a camp where people are making it, selling it, or using it, you're going to make that same trek on the bus or whatever to get to your 2-hour group session every week. And then you're going to go back to that camp and stay clean. I don't think that's going to happen. So we need to revamp those systems. Right now in Santa Clara County, we have 31 treatment beds for substance abuse, and we have thousands of people who are addicted. It's not just our unhoused people who have a door that they can shut, so you'd never know that they were struggling with alcohol or substance abuse addiction. So those are two primary examples. We talked about affordable housing. It costs $1 million per unit to build affordable housing in this county. It costs $140,000 per unit to build a unit of emergency interim housing, which is a modular setup with a bathroom and a door that locks. Congregate services on site, case management, mental health. You have a kitchen, you have a laundry room, you have 24/7 security, and you have people to help you manage your needs 24/7 so you can stabilize. The data that we're finding from these sites are that within 3 to 6 months, somebody who's been chronically homeless is able to regain some mental acuity, regain their social skills, increase their physical acuity. So now they're able to function and make healthy decisions that aren't based on crisis. That allows them to get housed. And an example of that is 3 years we've been gathering the data. 44% of the people that go from our interim emergency or bridge housing sites actually go to permanent housing successfully. And 2 years later, 81% of those people are still housed. So that's 44%. As Mr. Steinberg was saying, if we could just get half of these people off the street right away, that would make a huge difference. That's one way to do it. Invest in these interim modular sites. 13% of the people in congregate shelters that we operate go to permanent housing. The major difference is services. Congregate shelters do not offer the type of in-depth services needed because counties don't want to pay for it. Our county pays for a lot. Our city of San Jose, with over 1 million people, they pay for a lot. They work really well together. It's still not enough because of the NIMBYism issues. And if housing was a human right, and we had laws and regulations that enforced that and allowed us to build quickly and build in areas that were not always the same area, we'd make a huge difference. So 70% of the people that we serve identify as people of color. And we need to take those people and house them in all neighborhoods, not just in the east side or the lower income neighborhoods, but the nicer neighborhoods as well, because they will thrive. 70% of the people that work at Home First are also people of color. And so we know all too well that can happen. What we need in a larger space is we need to address the issues of systemic racism, as both of our previous speakers commented on. We need affordable or free education for everyone. We need affordable childcare. So first generation students aren't being taken out of school to care for younger siblings so their parents can work multiple jobs. We need a universal basic income for people at 30% or less. We also need more first-time homebuyer programs for people of color. The number one way to bust open generational poverty is home ownership. So we need to address all of these things at once. If we're going to end homelessness, we have to address the inflow as well as the outflow and the problem at hand. More shelters, I'm not necessarily a fan for, but I am a huge fan of the interim and bridge housing sites. They make a huge difference. They address the need. They house people with dignity, safety, and services. And these people get well and they do great in the community. Thank you so much for your time. And if you have any questions afterwards, feel free to reach out to me at the agency.
Thank you so much, Ms. Hurton. We do have some questions. If you have more, please send them to the end of the aisles and all. So one question we have, I think maybe coming from a bunch of law students or perhaps others, is about the Martin versus Boise case, the big Supreme Court case, which people have said, hey, doesn't that establish a right to housing? So could one of you or a number of you please comment on whether it does, doesn't? What's the issue there?
So my office brought Martin.
Just press this.
Just press and hold it. Sorry, thank you. So my office, along with Idaho Legal Aid and Latham and Watkins, filed Martin v. Boise. And the case went up to the Ninth Circuit, which is the largest federal appellate circuit court in the country. And the opinion does not establish a right to camp. It doesn't establish a right to shelter. In fact, the court was very careful to say the opinion does not obligate cities to do anything. They don't have to establish new shelters. They don't have to establish places where people can be. The only thing a government is obligated to do is not violate the Eighth Amendment's cruel and unusual punishments clause. In the context of criminalization of homelessness, what that means is if a person is engaged in universal and unavoidable activity, survival activity, like sleeping, sitting down, standing, all the things that we're all literally doing right now, that all human beings must do. You cannot punish a person for engaging in that activity in public space when they lack any alternative to that public space. That's the limited holding of Martin v. Boise. So it's helpful. It's important. People across this country, some people are doing months in jail for sleeping. In the Ninth Circuit, that's clearly prohibited under constitutional analysis. It's not the law of the United States. And there's a target on that lawsuit's back. So even that really limited remedy is something that the United States may not be ready for right now.
Can I add one thing?
Absolutely.
I support the doctrine of Martin v. Boise, so thank you. I think it is internally consistent, and it's one of those rare common sense opinions. In other words, if you believe as I do that people don't have the right to live wherever they want, I believe people should live indoors. You have no right, the government has no right to enforce that unless you can offer somebody something that is real and dignified, that represents an alternative. So it does, I think, kind of lay the predicate for a right to housing, but it's not a right to housing. You're right, because it doesn't take the next step and obligate government to build sufficient housing to be able to address the need. And local governments gnash their teeth about Martin v. Boise. It's making it difficult. Well, then society needs to grapple with the fact that we don't have enough housing, we don't have enough services, there's not enough coordination between various levels of government to create the continuum of care for people. Where it then gets tricky, and again, where would be a fun debate here, an interesting debate, is whether or not you believe, I can tell you what I believe, that when the society does offer somebody more than one alternative that is dignified and that is real, I think the society then has the legal right and the moral right, ethical right, to say you can no longer sleep here outside. And that does divide, people in life and in California. But to me, it's like we shouldn't argue that much, because until the government and the society provide the right, you don't even get to the second question.
I'm going to have to just turn to my colleague Boo Riley to close out, because I know there's a hard stop about now. I think another class may be coming in. So Boo, if you close us out.
We could lock the door.
You have a right to stay in the law school room. Well, thank you very much, Mayor Steinberg, for that great talk, and for our two respondents. You guys packed a lot in. So Thank you to the audience for coming out to learn more about this vexing problem and get in the weeds on some of the aspects of it and get into the moral questions and the bigger questions. So really appreciate that. We hope to be sponsoring more events like this. If anything in today's discussion or the idea of this unhoused initiative is of interest to you, please feel free to reach out to David, Jamie, myself, Marlene, and I think Sarita has left, and we will be in touch with you. I would say as our first event, we have set a high bar for future events, and we hope to see you at some of those. Thank you.